Today we're going to talk about a new topic, friends. The friend functionality has been added to C++ in order to allow a class to access data that is private to a different class. By declaring a function or a class to be a friend of another class, that friend has access to the private parts of that class. A friend function can be standalone, or it can be a member of another class, and we declare friends with the friend keyword. Here's an example of a standalone declaration. We have a class called int_val, and it's just holding an integer called the val. Very simple class that you would never write, but gives us an example. So if we have a function that is a standalone function that's declared to be setVal, see it has no scope on here, so it's just a standalone function, and it is accessing from our int_val, the variable name of our int_val is IV, and so it's accessing that IV private data member, the value, and changing its value. Normally, you couldn't access this because it's private, and you could only change that value or get that value from methods that are defined on the class. And this method is not defined on the class. By declaring it as a friend, so we just put the keyword friend and put a prototype of the function. We're not going to define it inside the class. We're just putting the prototype. The definition is standalone, but because we use this friend keyword, it's saying if you see the function that has the signature, then we're going to allow this function to access the private data members of my class. Let's look at another example. Here we have two classes. First, we're going to just give the prototype or the declaration of int_val without saying what's in there. That says, don't worry, I'm going to define int_val as a class later. And this some other class right here is actually going to be taking this int_val class as a parameter in a setNum function. When we call the setNum function, we want to be able to access the private data members from this int_val that was passed in. So now when we actually go ahead and declare int_val, remember this one's just saying, I'm going to define that class later. And so here's the declaration of that class. And we can see that it's creating the same int_val. And yet this time, when we declare our friend, you see that the setNum is scoped to the other class, saying in other class, there's going to be a setNum that's defined, and that setNum function can see the private parts of int_val because I'm saying that that function is a friend of int_val. Therefore, when you define your other class setNum function, you can use this IV.theValue and set that private data member to the new value. Let's take a look at this example coded up. So here we have our pre-declaration of int_val. Now, of course, if we wanted to actually write these classes, we want to separate them into their own files with headers and CPPs, but I'm just going to have it all in one file so you can see how it works. So we're pre-declaring this int_val so that we can use the int_val in other class, and then we're defining int_val, and right now I've commented out the fact that these are friends, and we just have a getVal in here, and notice that I'm letting the value be public. Therefore, we don't have to worry about any access issues because it's public. So if we call setNum and we assign a value, that should work because it is public. When we call setVal, that's the global function. Again, we have no issues because that's public. In fact, in main, we can just access that value directly and assign it a number because it's public. So let's step through that code. I'm going to declare int val test, which is of type int val. And the first thing we're going to do is write out what the value is. Well, you can see we didn't write a constructor. So it's using the C++ provided constructor. And so it's not going to do any initialization of that value, and we should just have garbage. And sure enough, that's what we have in int. Our initial value is just garbage. Okay, so then we can step through, and now we're going to directly access this variable that's of type int val, and just use the dot operator to access that data member. And because it's public, we can just change that value to 3. So if I step through, you can see that after we assigned to 3, it's printing out that it actually has the value 3, and there were no issues. So let's step again. This time we're calling our global function setVal. There's no scope on here, it's just a global function. And we're going to change that value to 5. And sure enough, no problem, that function works. I'm going to step again. And now what we're going to do is use this other class. We're going to create an instance of other class. And then that other class has a method on it. Remember, it's setNum. We defined it up here. We defined setNum on other class. So from other class test, we're going to call that setNum. And we're going to pass in our int val test variable. So it passes that class in. And here's an ampersand, so it's passing it in by reference so we can update that value, and we're going to update it to 13. Again, we have no problems with it because it's publicly accessible. And so we do go ahead and update the value to 13. Now, if we want to truly encapsulate our data and hide that from the other users, so that if we want to change our class internally, it won't affect any users of our class, then we want to make that variable private. So we're going to change this to be a private data member, and we've been consistently asking you to make your data members private. So now if I change that to private, you can see already that C++ is unhappy. It's trying to tell me that I can't access the value in this function because it's private. I can access the value in my getVal here because that's part of my int val class. That's defined in my int val class. And in fact, it's defined in line. It's defined inside the declaration. We just went ahead and defined it that it's going to return the value right away. And so it has access to these private data members because it's part of the class. Now this other class, setNum, is a completely different class, and it's trying to access that private data member. So the compiler is telling, no, 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 you can't access that. So if we want to allow this to access the private data members, we can declare this function as a friend. So let me take the comments out here. And now we've declared that in my other class that there's a method that we're going to allow to see the private parts of int val. So now if we go ahead and try to run this, we will see that you can access that value. So let me try to build it. And you see the Visual Studio didn't recognize right away that this friend was giving access, but now that we've done the build, you can see that it has now recognized that it has access. But we still have errors because we can't access the value from the set value call. So we have to also make this one be a friend if we want to be able to access that private data member. And so we'll declare setVal to be a friend also. Okay, and so this is a little trickier for the IDE to process. So let's go ahead and do the build so it can figure out that the value is now accessible to this setVal method. And you can see we're down to one error. And that's this error here, where we're trying to do a general assignment in main of a private data member of a class. And that just isn't allowed. There's no way to change that or to make that a friend. It's just not accessible. So we're going to comment out those couple lines of code. And now we should be able to run the program. So the initial value is still garbage. We can run setVal, and even though setVal is going to try to change a private data member, right here, it's going to change that private data member. It's allowed because it was declared as a friend. And so then we can see that that call did set the value to 5. Okay, let's step into the next one. Here, we're trying to set a private data member again. And it's going to allow us to do it because we declared that method as a friend. And you can see it changed it to 13. Now let's say that you have two closely related classes and you don't want to specify just a particular function of a class to be a friend of that new class because the entire class is going to be working directly with that new class. So you can declare an entire class to be a friend of a class. Therefore, any methods inside this, defined inside this friend class, will have access to any of the private data members or private functions defined in new class because the entire class has been declared as a friend. And so that's how friends work. You want to only use friends when it is a method that is closely related to the class but can't be implemented directly on the class. There really aren't that many cases where friends are needed, although it's very useful in some cases, and we're going to look at one of those cases coming up shortly.